Hi everybody, and thank you again for your company on Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, I'm reviewing the Nanlux 2400B. This is a 2,400 watt maximum power draw bicolor COB light with green and magenta correction. It has a CCT range from 2,700 Kelvin all the way up to 6,500 Kelvin. At 3,200 Kelvin, it is realistically comparable to a 10K tungsten, and at 5,600 Kelvin, it is realistically comparable to an M40. Add CRMX into the mix, and all I can say is, take my money. Okay, so straight up, a lot of you are going to want to know, is this thing really an M40 HMI replacement? Now, I can't give you the answer to that because I sold all of my M40s last year. If you want to know if these are a 4K HMI replacement, there's an episode in Meet the Gaffer with Luke Searvell with another couple of gaffers where they actually do a side-by-side comparison. Go along and have a look at that. That'll tell you what you need to know. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is why my spectrometer readings in this review are going to be so dramatically different to every other reviewers. I was lucky enough to figure something out at the last minute and then reshoot this episode. So what I have found is the current firmware in this has a very trivial error in it, which has a significant outcome in terms of the quality of light coming out of the unit. So let me explain what I found. Okay, so this light has, what do they call it? It's in the menu system. Modifier Recognition. Okay, so if I take the dish off the front, the light will shut down. So this is the recognition here. It has pins, and those pins will talk to a microchip on the dish, okay, if it has the recognition chip. Now, that serves two purposes. Number one is safety. So if, for example, you accidentally put a reflector on for a 1200, which would turn into a smoke machine, this light won't fire up, okay? Now, if you want to run this with no modifier on the front, well, then you have to go into the menu system and turn the recognition off. And when you do that, you get a warning that stays on the screen for about 10 seconds. And then you can fire it up with no modifier attached. All right, that's a very important detail. Okay, the other reason that we have this recognition system is because this light has programmed into it calibration settings for all of the different modifiers. But having said that, when I was taking some of the final shots for this episode, like this one here, I could see by eye that I was getting dramatically better results than I was for the rest of my testing. And when I ran a spectrometer over the light, it verified what my eyes were seeing. The light, for some reason, was giving way better results now. It took me a very long time to figure out that what had actually happened was the shot before, I was running the light without a modifier on. So I had the menu system set up with the recognition turned off. And then when I put the reflector back on for the next shot, I didn't turn the light off or reset the programming. So in case you're not following, let me break it down a little bit more. If you've got the 45-degree dish on the front and you've got the recognition system turned on, then you are not getting calibrated light output. If you've got the 45-degree dish on and you've got the recognition system turned off, then you are getting the calibrated light output. Essentially, they've got the programming backwards. The calibrated light output is turned off when it should be turned on, and it's turned on when it should be turned off. So until they fix up the firmware, this is a bit of a problem. Every time you turn this light on, you're going to have to go into the menu system and set the recognition to off if you want the best quality out of the reflector. But here's the plus side. If you own one of these lights and you've been really happy with it and you haven't noticed this error, you won't believe how much better it looks. If you were happy before, you're going to love it now. Now, I did a little teaser video on my social media letting everybody know I was testing this for this review. And I got inundated with questions from Australian gaffers like, can you run this off a domestic power outlet? Can you run it off a 3 kVA generator? And could you run it off a 2,400 watt battery system like an EcoFlow? All right, so before we get into talking about the first thing, can you run it off domestic power? I need to point out that I live in Australia, and Australia is a high voltage country. If you live in a low voltage country, say 120 volts, then none of this information is going to apply to you. You need to do your own research for that country. Now, a domestic power outlet in Australia is rated at 10 amps, and that'll be running off a 16 or 20 amp power circuit. Running this off a domestic 10 amp power outlet here in my workshop during the middle of the day, with it set to 5600 Kelvin, running at 100% brightness, with the power setting to maximum and the fans running at full blast, it typically pulls 9 amps. But here's the catch. At 7:30 at night, it's pulling 10.53 amps. So why is there a difference? Well, because the voltage went down, and that's what we need to talk about. So the Australian regulations for voltage is not 240 volts. That's what a lot of people think it is. It is actually 230 volts minus 6% and plus 10%. Now, if you do the math on that, that's a voltage range 216 volts to 253 volts. So I'm not going to give you a straightforward answer as to whether you can run this off an Australian domestic power outlet. And I'm not going to do that for the exact same reason that the local supplier supplies this with a 15 amp C-norm connection and a 15 amp C-norm to 15 amp flat pin connection. And that is public liability. With the light set to 100% brightness, the output set to maximum, and the fan set to full, and the light running off 30 meters of 1.5 millimeter core HAR insulated cable, these are my results. As you can see, some of them are below 2300 watt, which would be 10 amps at a nominal 230 voltage. And some of those figures are slightly above. Okay, so for argument's sakes, you're a younger, inexperienced gaffer in Australia and you're looking to buy one of these and you didn't pick up what I was putting down. Here's my advice to you. Just buy some 15 amp power cable to run between the light and the power outlet. And when you go to plug it into the power outlet, use a caravan adapter. A caravan adapter is a 15 amp to 10 amp adapter, which has a 10 amp circuit breaker in it. This will ensure that you don't go over 10 amps. Now, if you're running this thing at 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin in the middle of the day, and assuming that you're in an inner suburb where the voltage is usually above nominal, you will probably never ever trip that breaker. But if you're in a situation where you can't afford to trip the breaker, maybe you're doing live to air TV, then just run it at say 97% and you should be fine. Now let's talk about power factor unity. That is a very important thing when it comes to running something like this off portable generators, or possibly you want to run this off a power outlet and you have to have it substantially dimmed to compensate for a long cable run. Now the power factor unity on this light is superb. At 100% and 75%, it is reading 0.98. All the way down at 50%, it is still scoring 9.7. Not only does that mean that running this dimmed, you are not likely to have a meltdown, but if you want to run this at 100% brightness off something like a 3 kVA generator, it's going to be very friendly. Now I've done a lot of testing running this off my 3 kVA generator, and I've run it several times at different kelvins with 30 meters of 1.5 mil HAR insulated cable for 3.5 hours continuously. So why do I stop the testing at 3.5 hours? Because I'm about to run out of petrol. In terms of running this off an EcoFlow Delta Max, which has a 2.4 kilowatt maximum output, I was getting continuous run times of 46 to 48 minutes. Now, just something to note if you're planning to do this, at the end of that cycle, those batteries are running very hot. It does take several hours for them to cool down enough that you can recharge them. Okay, now getting back to the cables that are supplied in the Australian version, this is a pretty shitty solution, and I don't think any gaffer is going to be happy with this. All right, so if you're looking to make your own cable, the connector that plugs into the transformer is not available to purchase as a separate connector. Even if you go to the manufacturer, they can't sell it to you because this is under license for 2 years to Nanlux. Now you can buy this adapter cable for about 90 Australian dollars as a spare part, and the other alternative is you could recycle this connector. So you can disconnect this. It is not filled with silicon or anything like that. Now, one of the reasons I'm going to be changing this out is this connector takes up a lot of space when I'm wrapping up the cable, and it's not really a long enough cable solution to be effective on set. But just something to consider, if you're going to recycle this plug top here, you could be voiding your warranty. All right, so before we get into the pros and cons, let's talk about something that I've discovered. And this is something you're going to want to know about as a gaffer as we move forwards into the era of high-powered COB lights. All right, so you might be hearing this rumor that you don't need to wait for these to warm up like you had to with the HMIs. Strictly speaking, that is not true. All right, so if you turn one of these on and then start taking your meter readings for, say, your brightness or your f-stops, that's not a problem at all. But what does change over a bit of time is the delta UV or green magenta values, and even the CCTs can change a little bit. So if you turn one of these on and take a spectrometer reading, and then 2 minutes later take another spectrometer reading, that second reading will be closer to your target values that you dialed into the light. If you wait another 2 minutes, what I have found is that spectrometer reading will be smack on where you dialed your values into, or as close as it's ever going to get. Now, this isn't a brand specific issue. This is happening in the Nanlux, and I've also noticed it happening in the Electrostorms. So this must be something to do with the phosphor. Now, here's another thing to point out. Let's say you're running this at 30% brightness, and then you fire it up to 100% brightness. Same thing applies. It'll probably be another couple of minutes before the phosphor stabilizes and you get consistent light values. So how big a difference is it between the light being cold and the light being warmed up? Well, if I was shooting a sequence and the story said that we had to go from 0 brightness to 100% brightness, I wouldn't be particularly worried. I don't think anybody would notice it because the difference is less than that of a 1/8 correction gel, well within that sort of tolerance range. Less difference than you got from one HMI bulb to another HMI bulb, if you're following what I'm telling you. Now, if I was shooting a sequence where it's got a lot of cutting, so maybe it's a drama sequence, and then we went to lunch and then came back and continued filming, I would definitely want to fire up the light 5 minutes beforehand just to make sure everything matches identically so that the color grader doesn't have to do any additional work. The color grader will definitely notice. All right, so let's get into how much these things cost and the pros and cons. So this sells for about $6,650 and about 11,200 Australian dollars. So if that sounds expensive, that's about half of what I paid for my 4K HMIs, and it's about on par with what we used to pay for a tungsten 10K, which is what this is the equivalent of allegedly when it's running in its warm white modes. All right, so let's get into the cons first. And the big con I've got is this dish. Everything else packs down nice and small, but this dish is huge. This is the hardest thing to find a storage spot for in my van, not the actual light or the power supply itself. Now, continuing on with the negatives, the big negative for me is the lack of accessories that are currently available. I know what's going to happen here. The guys at Nanlux are going to put comments down below saying, hey, look, it takes time to get everything right and all this sort of stuff. But here's the situation. A lot of gaffers I've spoken to had a terrible year last year. Okay, they didn't make a lot of money and they can't afford to buy this outright. Their plan is to sell their M40 or whatever lights this is replacing. Their plan is to sell those lights to pay for this. And they don't want to do that right now because the advantage you've got with an M40 is you can spot it up. At the moment, you can't spot this. We don't have a spot dish and we don't have a Fresnel for it. So its application is a little bit limited currently to this dish, having no modifier on the front or having a softbox if you've got a pre-existing one. Now, if you're going to run your pre-existing softbox, you're going to need to turn the recognition system off in order for it to run. Now, the next negative, and it's something to be aware of more than just being a negative at this stage, is if you're running this with, say, an octadone on the front, so just imagine we've got that at the moment, and you've got this, say, 12 or 15 foot up in the air coming over the top of one of your sets, and you've built the set around it. Okay, so that's actually happened to me. Now, you get to the end of the first day of filming and you turn the power off. Now, the next morning when you come back in and you turn the power back on, you're standing there waiting for the light to fire up across the back of the set, and it doesn't fire up because you have to go into the menu system and turn off the device recognition in order for it to work again. Okay, so that is something to be aware of. If you've got this in a lighting grid and you're running something that doesn't have the chip on the front or you don't have a modifier on, if you power down and then power back up, you're going to have to turn the recognition system back off again, and that can be problematic if you've got this thing rigged. Now, I think it's important that the recognition system automatically turns on if the light's powered off and powered back on, because if you're renting this out, you don't want the next person burning things not being aware that the recognition is turned off. But here's a simple solution that the opposition have done. They've made rings that have the recognition system in them that have accessory holders on the front. So that would be nice if they had something like that. So if you wanted to run it as an open face light, you wouldn't have to go into the recognition software because it would know that it's got an open ring on the front. Now, the next thing you should know about, which is a pro or a con, depending on how you look at it, is this light has a very slow decay rate. So what that means is if you turn the light off, it doesn't decay to black instantly. It has a slow fade down. So the phosphors are still energized. They're still glowing after the power has been turned off. Now, to show you the extent of this, I've got the camera set to automatic exposure in the center of the beam, and now I'm going to go to black. Now, this is a very over-the-top way of showing you this, but it's the only way that I can really illustrate it. Now, to give you an idea of how over-the-top that is, if I turn the light back on, everything goes off like a nuclear bomb. So what I'm going to do now is lock the exposure to that center point and then turn the light off. So this is a more realistic example of the decay rate. Now, where this is a pro is this light is going to be insanely high-speed flicker-free. So let's say, for example, it's running pulse width modulation. Any gap in between the pulses is going to be filled in by this decay rate. So is it pulse width modulation or is it potentiometer dimming? I can't tell because of the decay rate. All right, continuing on with things that could possibly be negatives. The COB is a bit bigger than its oppositions. So if you're looking for a point light source with very sharp shadows, this is a little bit softer. Maybe that's a negative, maybe it's not. But in terms of the pros, let's get into the pros now. This is definitely, as a kit with the power supply, this is definitely a way lighter solution than its oppositions. Comparing it to what it's replacing, it is incredibly light and incredibly small. Now, the build quality is what you'd expect from a Nanlux product. It's pretty good. They've learnt a lot as they've gone along. It's got the removable stirrups. The menu system is the same layout. It's very easy to use. The only real difference is you've got green magenta values here. So it's got plus and minus green magenta values to 80. So that's plus 80 delta UV and minus 80 delta UV. So that's plus 0.0080 delta UV or minus 0.0080 delta UV. And it's pretty accurate with that. Now, just something to note, other lights in this sort of class only go up to about a 50, but this doesn't really go up to 80. So what I mean by that is when you get very, very high on the plus greens, particularly if you're at the end of the CCT ranges, what happens is the light level starts to reduce slightly. So I think the greens have hit maximum and then they bring the other LED emitters down to get you to that plus 80 value. So that's not really a pro or a con. You could make the argument that it's clever programming, but it is something to be aware of if you do want to run it with a lot of plus green, you might be sacrificing a bit of brightness. Now with the power supply, it does have a cooling fan, but it's running pretty quiet. At the moment, it's blasting straight into my microphone to give you some idea of how loud that is. Another thing to note with the power supply, it is not backwards compatible with your other Evokes. So your other Evokes run 48 volts, this is running 96 volts. Now one massive improvement they have done is with the cooling fan. So it's got a massive cooling fan on the bottom, and a massive cooling fan on the top. Now the cooling fans look to me to be sitting on some sort of rubber bushing, so they've got a bit of suspension in there. And this has really decreased the noise because the housing doesn't resonate. Okay, so let's go into the cooling system and turn the fans to full blast so you can hear it. I actually think that this runs quieter than the 1200B. Now the light does come with a free remote control, but I don't know if this is a pro or not because it doesn't have much of a transmission range. And also you can't see the values that you're dialing into the light. And we've also discovered on set that you can have problems if you're trying to transmit through a double insulated window. Other pros for the unit include its IP rating. Both the head and the power supply can be used outside in the rain. And it also has built-in CRMX control. In addition to the CRMX, you've also got a USB input, 2 local area network connections, 5-pin DMX in and out, and you've also got a remote control option, which is for an external hardwired controller, which will apparently be available after the 10th of January. Another design improvement is the external casing of the reflectors is now metal. So unlike with the 1200 reflectors, if you drop this and it lands on its side, you're not going to dent the internal reflector. Now the last pro for me is the clamp that comes with it that enables you to mount the power supply to your light stand. Now this has actually become a big pro for me because I've got 2 of the 900s, 4 of the 1200Bs, and now 2 of these. If I use the power supply in place of a shop bag on the light stand, that is 8 less shop bags that I have to carry around in my van. Okay, let's see how this light performs with no modifier attached. Now on this section of the beam here, the light does have a green hue to the equivalent of about a 1/8 correction gel. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. The shadows are not as sharp as other point source lights at a distance of 3 meters. But at a distance of 10 meters, they are absolutely razor sharp. Now let's have a look at it punched through a window with some lace curtains at about 5 meters away. And it isn't as sharp as you'd get on, say, the 1200, which has a smaller LED array. But it's still pretty good. If you're working outdoors, this can deliver a massive amount of coverage. This represents a big time saving for me, as I can now terrorize 3 of my neighbors at a time. Now the spread out of this COB is wide enough that it has absolutely no problem when it comes to lighting the inside of a 5-foot octadome. When I expose down for the front surface, you can see it's not perfectly evenly lit, but it's really close. Not that you'd be able to tell when the light's at 100% brightness. Now let's have a look at how it performs with its 45-degree reflector attached. Now all of the colour is mixed together evenly from edge to edge. There is no colour hue going off to the sides. Now just to put these brightness readings into some sort of perspective, it is almost double what we were getting out of the 1200B. At a distance of 3 meters, the shadows are what I would call alien. But at a distance of 10 meters, you get shadows that are very reminiscent of that from an M40. You've got the hard shadow with a little bit of soft wraparound. The only difference is the shadows are consistent from edge to edge of the beam. Now let's have a look at it through some lace curtains at a distance of 5 meters away. And my gut feeling is that the shadow quality is the same as you'd get off an M40. Now I have to say that's my gut feeling because I sold all of my 4K lights about a year ago. Now if you're lighting a large area, the 45-degree reflector does actually supply quite an even beam. And just for the record, this is one of my neighbours. I actually do ask their permission before I go lighting the street up. Now for the exciting part of the video, the DMX testing. Now, if this is just too much excitement for you to handle, you can skip this segment by going down to the index. I have the Evoke running off an 8-bit profile and it's receiving its commands via its internal CRMX receiver. To give you something to compare it to, I have a Titan tube which is also receiving its commands via its internal CRMX receiver. Both lights are receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start off with instant on-off commands. Now let's take a look at some half-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 1-second cues. Now let's take a look at some 2.5 second cues. And now for some 5 second cues. Now let's have a look at some CCT changeovers between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant changeovers. Now for some half-second changeovers. Now for some 1 second changeovers. Now for some 2.5 second changeovers. And now for some 5 second changeovers. Alright, let's take a look at the data I've collected, starting off with the dimming characteristics. Let's start off by looking at the dimming characteristics. According to my frequency meter, this light is running potentiometer dimming, as in no frequency is detected. Now I'm not 100% certain that that is correct because of the slow decay rate on the phosphor of the LEDs. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 3200 Kelvin. I've taken readings at 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, 10%, 5%, 1% and 0.1%. As you dim the light, the CCT slowly decreases. The total variation is only 194 Kelvin. Now the TN30 color render score actually goes up when you dim the light, from a 95 to a 96. What's remarkable is the white point, delta UV or color hue when you're dimming. There is virtually no perceivable change. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 5600 Kelvin. Between 100% and 25%, the CCT is fairly consistent, but below 25%, it does rise sharply. The total amount of variation is 570 Kelvin. The color render scores are a consistent 95 all the way down to 25%, then they drop to a 94. And the white point, delta UV or color hue is fairly consistent. The maximum amount of variation is less than the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. The CCT accuracy to the target value dialed in on this light is amazing. The most it was ever out by was only 44 Kelvin. Now let's have a look at the color render scores measured in TM30RF. At 2700 Kelvin, it has its lowest score of 94. The rest of the time, it's either scoring a 95 or a 96. Now, while that sounds impressive, its daylight SSI score was only a 77. Now let's have a look at the average delta UV or white point. Between 2700 to 4000 Kelvin, it's tracking ever so close to the Planckian curve with an average delta UV of plus or minus 0.0004. Between 4100 Kelvin to 5000 Kelvin, it breaks away from the Planckian curve and slowly tracks up towards the daylight curve, which is why I haven't given an average. From 5100 Kelvin to 6000 Kelvin, it tracks between the daylight and the Planckian curve. Okay, let's take a closer look at some of our kelvins, starting off with the lowest Kelvin that we can dial in. When I dialed in 2700 Kelvin, I got 2652. The TN30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with a 101% average color saturation. With the CRI scores, R9 and R12 were below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point was spot on with a delta UV of 0. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3172 with an SSI score of 87. The TN30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point was almost perfect with a delta UV of only plus 0.0001. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4363. The TN30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 was below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0007, which would give it an imperceivably green color hue to roughly 1/3 of a 1/8 correction gel equivalent if you didn't dial in any correction. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5629 with an SSI score of 77. The TN30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, R12 is the only one below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0025. So if your camera's working to the Planckian curve, that would make this light green to the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel if you didn't dial in any correction. And if your camera's working to the daylight curve, this is pretty close to spot on. When I ran the light at its top Kelvin, 6500, I got 6544. The TN30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0022. Okay, so my closing thoughts on this light, well, it's impressive. I mean, look at the firepower you've got with CRMX control. That is just amazing. I didn't think that this would be possible even just a couple of years ago. And even just a couple of years ago, I wouldn't have thought it'd be possible to run something like this off a battery system. That's a little bit crazy in itself. But here's the thing. Where are the accessories? At the moment, we've only got one dish. We're going to need to see a Fresnel, we're going to need to see spot dishes, maybe some other attachments for it. At the moment, this is a little bit limiting. So people that are buying this are really taking a big jump and a big leap of faith that Nanlux are going to release those accessories when they say they're going to release them. So Nanlux, don't let us down.